There's a painful truth many people struggle to accept. Sometimes, no matter how much you give, how much you sacrifice, or how deeply you care, it still won't be enough for the wrong person. Not because you lack value, but because they are wired differently. When you're dealing with someone who is emotionally avoidant, your love isn't rejected because it's not good. It's rejected because it asks them to do something they've spent their entire life avoiding. And until you understand what they are truly loyal to, you will keep confusing their distance for something you can fix. Avoidants don't experience emotional safety the same way you do, and that's where everything begins to shift. For you, feeling close to someone, being understood, supported, and emotionally connected creates a sense of calm and security. It feels like home. But for an avoidant, that same level of closeness can feel like pressure, like something is being taken from them rather than given. So while you move toward connection to feel safe, they move away from it for the exact same reason. When an avoidant starts to sense emotional intensity building, even if it's healthy and genuine, their internal alarm system can quietly switch on. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It doesn't mean the moment itself is bad. It simply means that to them, deeper connection feels unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. So instead of leaning into the bond, they instinctively create space. Sometimes it's subtle. Slower replies, less enthusiasm, a shift in tone. Other times it's more obvious, pulling away, becoming distant, or needing time alone right when things seem to be going well. This is where it becomes confusing for you, because you're thinking, we were just getting closer. Things were improving. Why are they stepping back now? But from their perspective, that growing closeness is exactly what triggered the withdrawal. The connection didn't fail, it intensified, and that intensity made them uncomfortable. They're not measuring the relationship by how emotionally fulfilling it feels. They're measuring it by how much control they still have over their independence. And the moment they feel like they might lose that control even slightly, they recalibrate by creating distance. It's their way of regulating themselves, of returning to a place where they feel stable again. What makes this dynamic even harder is that your natural response is to close the gap. You want to reassure, to communicate, to show consistency and care. But those very actions, which would strengthen a secure bond, can feel overwhelming to someone who equates closeness with pressure. So the more you try to stabilize the connection, the more they feel the need to protect themselves from it. Over time, this creates a silent mismatch. You're trying to build something deeper while they're trying to keep things from getting too deep. You're seeking emotional safety through presence while they're seeking it through distance. And without realizing it, you both end up moving in opposite directions, even though neither of you may intend to hurt the other. Understanding this changes everything because it helps you stop personalizing their behavior. Their withdrawal isn't a reflection of your value or your effort. It's a reflection of what they've learned to associate with safety. And until they become aware of that pattern and actively work on it, they will continue choosing distance over connection, not because connection isn't meaningful, but because distance feels more manageable. One of the most frustrating realizations you'll come to is that effort in their world doesn't create the kind of attachment you expect it to. You can show up consistently, go out of your way, support them when they're down, be patient when they're distant, and still, it doesn't translate into deeper emotional closeness on their side. And that's the part that feels so unfair because you've been taught that love grows through what you invest. The more you give, the more it should build something meaningful. But with avoidance, effort doesn't land the same way. They don't interpret your actions as building blocks of attachment. In fact, sometimes they don't even register the emotional weight behind what you're doing. Not because they're cold or incapable of feeling, but because they've learned to downplay emotional dependency altogether. To them, relying too much on someone or having someone rely too much on them feels like a risk. So instead of your effort pulling them closer, it can actually make them feel like expectations are quietly increasing. And expectations to an avoidant can feel like pressure. You might think you're proving your loyalty, your care, your value. But what they might be experiencing is a growing sense that something is being asked of them in return, something emotional, something deeper, something they're not comfortable giving. So rather than leaning into appreciation and attachment, they instinctively create distance to avoid that sense of obligation. This is why you can do everything right and still feel like it's not enough. Because the issue isn't the quality or quantity of your effort. The issue is that effort is not the currency that builds security for them. Independence is. Space is. emotional self-sufficiency is. So when you give more, thinking it will strengthen the bond, it doesn't always have that effect. Sometimes it does the opposite. It highlights the imbalance between how much you're investing and how much they feel capable of reciprocating. And instead of stepping up, they step back. That's the painful paradox. The very thing that would deepen a secure relationship, consistency, care, emotional presence, can actually expose discomfort in someone who avoids emotional closeness. And because they don't process connection in the same way, they don't respond to your effort with increased attachment. They respond by protecting their autonomy. Over time, this leaves you feeling unseen. You start questioning yourself. Why doesn't this matter to them? Why aren't they responding? What else can I do? And slowly you fall into the trap of overgiving, believing that if you just try harder, something will click. But attachment doesn't work like that with avoidance. It's not built through accumulation of effort. It's limited by their tolerance for emotional closeness. And no amount of giving can push that boundary if they're not willing to expand it themselves. So you end up pouring more into the connection, hoping it will finally create the response you're looking for. Meanwhile, they remain emotionally measured, sometimes even distant, because for them, staying slightly detached feels safer than becoming fully invested. And the hardest truth to accept is this: your effort is not being rejected because it lacks value. It's being neutralized because it challenges the one thing they're trying to preserve, their emotional independence. There's a moment in these connections that feels almost surreal. Everything seems to be going well. The conversations are flowing, there's a sense of closeness building, maybe even a glimpse of something real forming between you. You start to relax into it. You begin to believe, okay, this is moving forward. And then, almost without warning, something shifts. They become distant, less available, less expressive. It's like they've taken a step back just as things were starting to feel secure. And that's exactly what's happening. When things get real, when the connection starts to carry emotional weight, avoidants often feel an internal need to pull away. Not because the connection is bad, but because it's becoming significant. And significance for them brings a level of vulnerability they're not used to holding. At first, they can show up. They can be charming, engaging, even emotionally present in small doses. Early stages feel easy because there's still enough distance to feel in control. But as that distance naturally starts to close, something inside them resists. The more real it becomes, the more it challenges their sense of emotional safety. So they detach. Sometimes it's subtle. They might take longer to reply, cancel plans more often, or seem less invested in conversations that used to flow effortlessly. Other times it's more abrupt. They might say they need space, act confused about their feelings, or suddenly question the relationship altogether. And from your perspective, it feels like everything is unraveling for no clear reason. But from their perspective, it's not random. It's regulation. They're trying to manage the discomfort that comes with emotional closeness. Because when something starts to matter, it also introduces the possibility of being hurt, being dependent, or losing control over their own space. And rather than sitting with those feelings and working through them, their instinct is to create distance so they can feel stable again. What makes this particularly difficult is that their withdrawal often happens at the exact moment you begin to invest more deeply. Just as you're opening up, they're closing off. Just as you're becoming more certain, they're becoming more unsure. And that contrast creates a confusing push-pull dynamic that keeps you off balance. You start wondering what changed. You replay conversations, looking for mistakes. You question whether you moved too fast or said too much. But in reality, it's not about a single action or moment. It's about the level of emotional reality the connection has reached. Because for an avoidant, it's easy to stay when things are light. It's easy to engage when there's no pressure, no expectation, no depth required. But when things cross into something meaningful, when there's emotional investment, consistency, and the possibility of something long-term, that's when the discomfort rises. And instead of moving closer to meet that moment, they move away from it. Over time, this creates a pattern where every step forward is followed by a step back. You feel like you're building something, only to watch it retreat just as it starts to take shape. And that inconsistency keeps you hooked because you've seen what it can be, you felt the connection when they're present. But the reality is, unless they learn to stay when things get real, the cycle repeats. Because their instinct isn't to deepen the connection when it matters most. Their instinct is to protect themselves from it. Consistency is something you believe should create security. You show up, You follow through, you communicate clearly, and you think, this is how trust is built. And in a healthy, secure dynamic, that's absolutely true. Consistency reassures. It stabilizes. It makes the other person feel safe enough to open up and meet you at the same level. But with someone who is avoidant, your consistency can have a completely different effect. Instead of feeling reassured by your steady presence, they can start to feel watched, expected, even subtly pressured. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your reliability highlights something they struggle with: the idea of being consistently emotionally available in return. At first, they may appreciate it. Your calm, grounded energy might even draw them in. It feels good to be around someone who is stable and clear, but as time goes on, that same consistency begins to carry an unspoken message. This is real. This is ongoing. This requires something from you, and that's where the shift happens. Because for an avoidant, the idea of being needed on a consistent emotional level can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a loss of freedom, like something is slowly becoming too serious, too binding. So instead of leaning into the stability you're offering, they start to pull back to restore their sense of independence. You might notice it in small ways. They become less predictable. They stop matching your effort. They might create space where there wasn't any before. And from your perspective, it feels confusing because you've been doing everything right. You've been patient, understanding, consistent, and yet instead of bringing them closer, it feels like it's pushing them away. This is where many people start to overcompensate. You double down on your effort. You become even more available, more understanding, more accommodating, hoping it will balance things out and bring them back. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more consistent you become, the more it emphasizes the contrast between your approach to connection and theirs. Your presence starts to feel like something they can't quite match, and instead of rising to meet it, they retreat to avoid feeling inadequate or pressured. And it's not always something they consciously recognize. They're not sitting there thinking, this person is too consistent, I need to leave. It's more subtle than that. It shows up as a feeling: restlessness, discomfort, a need for space that they can't fully explain. So they act on that feeling by creating distance without always understanding why. For you, this can feel deeply frustrating because consistency is your way of building something real. It's your way of saying, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But to them, that same message can feel like something is closing in, like the relationship is becoming too defined, too serious, too quickly. So they step back, not because your consistency is wrong, but because it activates their fear of losing autonomy. And this is where the dynamic becomes painful. Because the very thing that should create closeness ends up creating distance. You're trying to make the connection safer, while they're trying to make it less intense. And without realizing it, your strength, your ability to show up consistently, becomes something they struggle to receive, not because it lacks value, but because it asks them to meet you in a way they're not yet ready for. For someone who is avoidant, independence isn't just a preference, it's a core part of how they feel safe in the world. It's not something they occasionally lean on, it's something they rely on almost entirely to regulate themselves. Being self-sufficient, emotionally and practically, gives them a sense of control. It reassures them that they don't have to depend on anyone, and more importantly, that no one can have too much influence over their emotional state. So when intimacy starts to grow, when a relationship begins to ask for closeness, vulnerability, and mutual reliance, it can feel like a direct threat to that independence. Even if the connection is healthy, even if you're not asking for anything unreasonable, the mere presence of emotional closeness can trigger the feeling that they're losing a part of themselves. And that's the key difference. Where you may see intimacy as something that adds to your life, they can experience it as something that takes away from their autonomy. At the beginning, this isn't always obvious. They can engage, they can show interest, they can even enjoy the connection. But there's usually an invisible boundary in place, a limit to how close they're comfortable getting. As long as the relationship stays within that limit, things can feel relatively smooth. But once that boundary is approached or crossed, their instinct is to restore distance. Not because they don't care, but because closeness begins to feel like dependency. And dependency to them feels dangerous. So they start to rebalance things in subtle ways. They may focus more on their personal space, their routines, their work, or anything that reinforces their sense of individuality. They might become less emotionally expressive, less available, or more guarded. It's not necessarily a conscious decision to push you away. It's a way of pulling themselves back into a place where they feel grounded again. From your perspective, it can feel like they're choosing everything else over you. Their independence, their space, their freedom, it all seems to come first. And that can feel deeply personal, like you're not important enough to be prioritized. But in reality, it's not about you being less important. It's about independence being more essential to their sense of safety. This is why trying to get closer can sometimes create the opposite effect. The more the relationship asks for emotional presence, the more they feel the need to protect their independence. And the more they protect it, the more distant they become. It creates a quiet tension where you're trying to build us and they're trying not to lose me. And unless that dynamic is understood, it can lead to a lot of misinterpretation. You might see their distance as lack of care, while they see your desire for closeness as too much demand. You might try to reassure them by being more available, while they respond by creating more space. Over time, this imbalance becomes exhausting. You start to feel like you're constantly adjusting yourself just to maintain the connection, while they remain anchored in their need for independence. And the truth is, until they learn that intimacy doesn't have to erase who they are, they will continue to prioritize distance over closeness. Not because closeness isn't meaningful, but because independence feels like the only way they know how to stay in control of their emotional world. At the core of everything, beneath the distance, the mixed signals, and the emotional inconsistency, there is one pattern that explains it all. They are deeply committed to avoiding vulnerability. Not casually, not occasionally, but consistently, almost instinctively. This isn't just a habit. It's a form of self-protection that has become part of how they navigate every meaningful connection in their life. Vulnerability to you might represent honesty, closeness, and emotional depth. It's the moment where something real is built, where trust grows, where two people meet without defenses. But to an avoidant, vulnerability often feels like exposure. It feels like standing without armor, open to being hurt, judged, or overwhelmed. And because of that, they don't move toward it, they move around it. This is why you can have moments with them that feel genuine, even intimate, but rarely sustained. They might open up slightly, share something personal, or let you see a deeper side of them, but just as quickly, they pull back. It's like they give you a glimpse, then close the door before it can become a pattern. Not because those moments aren't real, but because staying in that space feels too risky for them. They've learned, often from past experiences, that being fully seen comes with consequences. So instead of embracing vulnerability as a pathway to connection, they treat it as something to limit, something to control, something to avoid whenever possible. And this becomes the lens through which they approach relationships. So when you try to deepen the bond, when you ask meaningful questions, express your feelings, or create emotional closeness, they don't always meet you there. Instead, they may deflect, change the subject, minimize the moment, or create distance altogether. Not because they don't hear you, and not because they don't care, but because what you're inviting them into feels unfamiliar and unsafe. Over time, this creates a dynamic where you're the one carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. You're the one initiating deeper conversations, expressing feelings, trying to build something more grounded and real. Meanwhile, they stay on the surface, engaging just enough to keep the connection alive, but not enough to fully step into it. And this is where the confusion often turns into frustration. Because you can feel that something is there. You can sense that they care in their own way. But it never quite translates into the kind of openness or emotional presence you're looking for. It feels incomplete, like a connection that never fully arrives. But when you understand that they are loyal to avoiding vulnerability, it starts to make sense. Every time the relationship asks them to go deeper, they instinctively find a way to stay protected. Every time there's an opportunity to open up more fully, they pull back to maintain control. And the hardest part is this: no amount of patience, reassurance, or effort from you can make someone embrace vulnerability if they are committed to avoiding it. That shift has to come from within them. They have to recognize the pattern, understand its cost, and choose to move beyond it. Until then, they will continue to keep one foot in and one foot out, close enough to feel the connection, but distant enough to never feel exposed. And if you're not careful, you can spend a long time trying to reach someone who is, in every subtle way, trying not to be reached.